Alright guys, so we're going to go ahead and begin talking about some of the more specific infections that you can get. This is my favorite part of all this stuff, and so over the next few class days we'll be breaking down, looking at some of these common causes of infectious disease. When you really look at it, infectious disease is just part of life. I mean, many of us had a cold or something like that in our first year of life, and most of us have gotten sick in some way pretty much every year since then. Fortunately, as we've already talked about, you've got an immune system that helps you defeat these things. But when you really think about things in the grand scheme, bacteria have just as much a right to be on our planet as we do. Even though sometimes our interactions with each other are not good, where we kill those bacteria quite frequently, and sometimes they kill us. So we do want to appreciate that they can be pathogenic, right? So I think in both classes people have asked and been a little confused maybe by this term. You know, a pathogen is anything that can make you sick. And so when we look at pathogens, or I've got infectious diseases here, but we could also just say pathogens. They can be all sorts of stuff, actually. They can be bacteria, as we've been talking about, and they can be viruses, as we've been talking about. But you can also get an infection from a fungus. You could get a parasite, and you could get something called a prion. Now, to address these other things here for just a minute, fungi and parasites are both eukaryotic, much more like our cells. So we're not going to go into these much. And one thing I would kind of like you to know is that fungi and parasites, because they are eukaryotes, are a lot harder for doctors to treat. Because any kind of medicine or something that might hurt those fungi and parasites would also probably hurt your cells because it's all eukaryotic. Now, some of the more common infections here, I wrote on the slide, fungi, athlete's foot is a fungus, makes your feet red, itchy. A similar thing can happen really anywhere on your body. Obviously, we wouldn't call it athlete's foot then. We call these Tineas. So an infection with a fungus of your skin is a tinea. So tinea can happen really anywhere. Ringworm sounds like a worm, but it's not. Ringworm is actually also a fungus. An infection of the skin forms sort of a round circle that can be kind of dry and scaly. And so originally, scientists thought this was a worm actually sitting under your skin. As it turns out, it's not. It's just a fungal infection as well. And then tapeworms are worms. This would be a parasite example. A tapeworm grows inside your gut tube, and it eats the food that you eat. Right? So generally, a tapeworm does not directly hurt you. It just weakens you because when you eat food, the tapeworm then steals that food, sort of like in your intestines, instead of you actually absorbing those nutrients. So people with a tapeworm become malnourished because it's kind of stealing the food they eat. This is how a parasite, weakens you, survives off of you, but hopefully doesn't kill you because that would also kill the parasite. Now, prions, we'll mention very briefly here. Prions are actually just proteins. They're not even self-replicating. They're not a cell or even so much as a virus, but just a protein. And there are only a couple of prion diseases. If you've heard of one before, you've probably heard of mad cow disease. And mad cow disease occurs, believe it or not, in cows. And then sort of the human version of this is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is caused by a prion. Really, the main way you would see someone get this is if they ingested some tissue that had this prion. So you really don't see much Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, except maybe in some countries where they might still be cannibalistic and eat other humans, or those kind of concepts, which you're not going to find very much anywhere on the planet now. But if you do, eat someone's brains who had a prion disease, you really easily get that prion disease. So don't eat other people, and you probably won't get Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Now, what we're going to focus on then is bacteria and viruses. I've got this broken down into little groupings. So we've got our gram-positive bacteria, our gram-negative bacteria, then our DNA viruses, and our RNA viruses. We're actually going to look at a lot more viral examples than bacteria, because viruses tend to have very unique presentation in people. Bacteria aren't always that way, and I'll explain that a little better in a moment. But this video is just going to cover our bacteria, which we're only going to have 3 examples of. So when you get a bacterial infection, a lot of times it's going to look the same way in a person. So you're going to have similar signs and symptoms from several different types of bacteria. Because of that, it's kind of hard for us to really pick out bacteria and explain what they particularly do to you. It kind of can become very vague. What I wanted to do was find some infections where if I gave you those symptoms, you would know right away what they had wrong with them. So if we did a lot of bacteria, there'd be a lot of overlap. And if I gave you symptoms, you'd kind of be like, well, it could be this, this, or this. And that's not really the purpose of our class. So we're going to look at 3 bacteria, 2 gram-positive examples, and a gram-negative example, and talk about what they do to you. So the first one is one of the most prevalent bacteria on our planet, which is Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is gram-positive, meaning it's really dark purple when we stain it, and it's a coccus, so it's a sphere. And Staphylococcus aureus, then, I know the picture's tiny, but it would be these little groupings of dark dots in this picture up here. So these Staph aureus bacteria appear in grape-like clusters. This is what you see in this picture. Now, a staph infection usually is localized at your skin. It's an irritation of your skin. And this is common in a lot of people. Staph infections cause infected hair follicles, right? So you've probably gotten an infected hair follicle before on your leg, your calf, because of shaving your leg or something like that. And that's probably a staph infection. And usually, keep it clean, it'll go away in a couple of days. Now, there are also a little bit more serious skin presentations that we can see from staph. These are also more rare, right? And all of the things that we're about to talk about here today are really, really rare if you practice good hygiene, right? If you bathe regularly, if you take good care of yourself, then you don't tend to see these things happening too often. However, there are people out there that don't, right? It might not be all their fault. You know, it could be somebody who's really impoverished in things. But if you don't take good care of yourself, keep yourself clean, then these things can show up. So first thing here is called folliculitis. Anything that ends in itis means inflammation, right? So this is inflammation of the follicles. If you just get one, like I said, on your leg or something, we don't really call that folliculitis. We say you have an infected follicle. If you have a widespread appearance of this, so like this picture is kind of hard to tell, but this guy's got a whole bunch of little red itchy spots, which are all a bunch of infected follicles, then we would say that that person has widespread folliculitis. One of the most famous types is called hot tub folliculitis. You may have experienced this before yourself, hopefully not, but if you get into a hot tub or a bathtub even that has jets in it, and it hasn't been cleaned regularly and taken good care of, then bacteria will grow in the tubing within the walls that provide water to those jets that shoot the water out, and those bacteria can cause a widespread folliculitis in you. My wife had a bad bout of this years ago when we were on a vacation, and so big thing doctors say is after you get in a hot tub, like at a hotel or something, you probably want to shower just in case. But as long as their chemicals are set right, you don't have an issue either. I bring that up, but also so you know, it's probably not staph. If you get hot tub folliculitis, that's actually caused by something else, a Pseudomonas type bacterium. So don't worry about that. But folliculitis, lots of itchy infected follicles. Second thing here is a furuncle/carbuncle, which is a fun medical name for a boil, right? So this picture here would be a boil on the eyelid, just a sort of a large kind of under the surface pimple is how you can think of this. And these can be really, really painful because of the pressure that builds up in there. Then we've got cellulitis. Cellulitis is sort of a soft tissue inflammation. So it causes, like in this poor kid, it causes just sort of a red, puffy swelling just under the skin. and it can be pretty serious sometimes if it persists for a long time. So cellulitis, not fun. Cellulitis also kind of uncomfortable because of the pressure that builds up. Now, necrotizing fasciitis is a flesh-eating disorder. So this is where your skin is like eating away at itself. There's a picture of this here in a minute. It's kind of nasty. Then impetigo. Impetigo is a fun word to say. Impetigo is also a skin infection. Got a picture of this on the next slide. It's a very serious sort of blistering of the skin where the skin is almost pulling away from its under layers, so it can get pretty ugly. And then scalded skin syndrome is this last picture down here. This poor little kid. This is a very small kid. This is their butt crack, for lack of a better term. So you're looking kind of at the lower part of their back here. Scalded skin syndrome is a widespread infection of the skin that causes the skin to start actually like peeling away as though it's burned. We call this sloughing off. So the skin starts to slough away. You see this every once in a while in little kids, and it can be pretty serious because it actually causes their skin to react as though they have been burned by something. So it can be quite damaging, but it's also very rare. Now, staph is also very commonly responsible for food poisoning. So when we say food poisoning, it doesn't mean you've drank poison, right? Food poisoning means that food has grown bacteria, and then you eat that, and it makes you sick. So staph, being so prevalent around us, very often grows on a food that's maybe sat out too long, right? Or things like that, hasn't been refrigerated properly, and then when you eat it, it makes you sick. Maybe makes you throw up for a day, makes you have diarrhea, those kind of things. So a lot of times staph is responsible for that as well. Finally, staph can also cause some really serious things. And what you can think of is if staph gets deeper down into you, it can cause more problems. So at the skin, usually is very treatable. The deeper it gets, the worse. And again, if you're a healthy person, if you take good care of yourself, these are very rare. But you can get endocarditis, which is infection of your heart with staph. You can get osteomyelitis, which is an infection of the bones. You can get a very serious kind of arthritis called septic arthritis. This is not to be confused with kind of like your common old people's joints hurting arthritis. This is caused by a bacterium. This is an infectious version of our arthritis. And then toxic shock syndrome is a widespread issue of the body where you have some blood pressure problems, you have a lot of stuff going on. And toxic shock really requires a widespread internal staph infection. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but toxic shock syndrome was a bigger deal years ago in the 80s and 90s. There weren't as good of instructions in terms of how long to leave a tampon in for a female, and if people left those in too long, which is really gross to think about, I know. If you left it in too long, then it would grow bacteria and it could cause toxic shock syndrome. And so I think even today there might even be warnings on packages of tampons telling you make sure you take these out at certain intervals and use new ones so that you don't get toxic shock syndrome. Now, last thing, this is a long slide to talk through, is the most serious issue you can have really with any infection is sepsis or septicemia. And what sepsis means is that you have an infection of the bloodstream. So basically you've got tons of staph or whatever bacterium it is growing in your bloodstream, which kind of like when we talked about cancer metastasis where it gets in your bloodstream and now you're in trouble, is very similar here, right? Once that staph or whatever is growing in your bloodstream, it can get to any part of your body and it can be deadly. And if it does that and it becomes harder and harder to treat, that's when we can see organ shutdown and those sort of really serious and severe issues. Now, usually staph is pretty easily treatable with antibiotics. So if you get some sort of staph infection of your skin, doctor can give you an antibiotic and it'll take care of it. Now, these really severe infections that we just finished talking about, those can be harder to treat and require maybe IV drugs or that kind of deal. Here, these pictures will show you. This was impetigo that I mentioned. This is a guy's forehead. This is a particular kind called bullous impetigo. But notice this really severe blistering of the skin, and he's got some scabs and stuff there too. And this is a pretty bad picture, but this is septic arthritis. Like I said, this is worse than just maybe your grandma's joints hurt from arthritis. This is a nasty infection of a joint that causes really, really severe pain and discoloration and things. Now, the reason staph is something that the media knows a lot about today is because staph is now often being called the superbug. A very particular strain of staph has we've begun to call Mersa, which stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Now, Mersa is a particular strain of staph, not the kind that's just growing on your skin all the time here, that shows resistance to methicillin, as the name implies, but also any of the penicillin-derived antibiotics. So any antibiotic that ends in cillin will usually kill staph, but if you have a Mersa infection, it does not respond to that medicine at all. So somebody's sick, we give them penicillin, they don't get better. That's an indication that they have a resistant staph infection. Now, this is really serious if you catch it in the hospital, because strains of Mersa found in hospitals appear to be the most resistant. So doctors are basically preserving medicines now, only using them on these infections, and most likely, in a given amount of time, they will also develop resistance to these other drugs too. But right now, and this is not something you need to really memorize, but I just think it's interesting, there are a couple of powerful and very expensive antibiotics that are only given to people who have severe Mersa infections. And these antibiotics are called Vancomycin and teicoplanin. And if you need these, they're going to put you in the hospital, and they're going to give you these via a Picc Line, which stands for peripherally inserted central catheter. This means they're gonna string basically a tiny little tube. So let's get a little picture here. So I got a guy here. It's a terrible, terrible picture, but that's okay. And what they will do is they will take this and they'll string a little tube, usually through the groin, a blood vessel there, and they'll run that tube up so that it drops off medicine right at your heart. And that's what a Picc Line is. So that medicine's going to go directly to your heart so it can be pumped throughout your body very rapidly. Again, this is super expensive, but this does tend to kill Mersa. Now, Mersa infections that are superficial on the skin are also still not that scary. We can give you medicines for that. It might take a little while to clear up, but you will clear up. So a lot of times people will get Mersa infections on their legs or on their arms or something, and they are treatable, and you may know a student or something or a classmate that's had this. It's when Mersa becomes internal that it's really dangerous. So if a Mersa infection becomes septic, the odds of you dying are fairly high. And so these are the people that we have to get into the hospital and get these drugs to. And again, it's super rare. Last thing I'll say about staph. I know I've been talking about it for a long time now. This is a picture of fairly advanced staph on the ankle of this guy. This is probably Mersa at this point. You'll notice he probably had sort of an infected follicle, and now it's ulcerating even more. So the opening is becoming bigger as cells are dying through necrosis. This particular picture comes from a guy who said that he thought he had a spider bite. So I bring this up just to warn you. Spider bites are extraordinarily rare. Spider bites can also be really severe if it's the wrong kind of spider, like a brown recluse. But usually, spider bites are not going to happen. So if you think you have a spider bite and you haven't been out camping or something, it's probably not a spider bite, and it probably is a Mersa infection that you should get some medicine for. So if you ever think you had a spider bite, you haven't really been out in the fields a whole lot, you probably want to stop into a clinic or something and have them take a look at it. Okay, second one, and these other two are going to be much quicker, I promise. Second bacterium from the gram-positive group is Streptococcus Pyogenes. And I think every one of us, it's safe to say, has had a Strep Pyogenes infection in our lifetime. Strep Pyogenes is your most common culprit for strep throat, otherwise known as bacterial pharyngitis. So there's a lot of reasons why you can get bacterial pharyngitis, right? An inflammation of your pharynx or throat. But if it's true strep throat, it probably is being caused by Streptococcus pyogenes. This is also a gram-positive coccus, so again, dark purple staining, little spheres, and usually Streptococcus shows up either in little pairs of spheres or in chains of spheres. So maybe they don't grow in clumps, but they actually grow in a little chain or string. Strep throat would look like this. I think we were talking about this just the other day in class randomly. These sort of pus-like exudates come out of the tonsils or the back of the throat. So you see these white globs. This is just being oozed out sort of your tissue. That's what an exudate means. As the caption tells you, also you're going to see enlarged tonsils, and you're going to see hyperemic tonsils. Hyperemic, I know what that means. Oh, I didn't mean to cover it up. Hyperemic means red. Right, so you're going to see redness, and then you're going to see these white exudates coming out. Now, strep pyogenes can also cause something called scarlet fever, which is much more serious. A lot of middle-aged individuals had scarlet fever when they were kids. It's not as common today, but basically, what can sometimes happen is if strep throat does not get treated, and this is why it was more common before. Today we have a lot more medicines and we treat things with them. But scarlet fever is where you have sore throat, and then you develop a rash as well, and it's a little bit more severe, kind of widespread infection of your body. Now, some other things that strep can cause, again, kind of like staph, if it gets deep into your body. Strep's known to cause nephritis, which is a kidney infection. It's known to cause something called rheumatic fever, which is a combination of inflammation around your heart, around your joints, and around your nerves. So as you might guess, this can be really, really serious and severe. Strep can also cause impetigo. Here's another picture of impetigo. This is not the bullous type, so notice this guy just has little tiny blisters on his nose versus those big nasty blisters on that guy's forehead on the last slide. And then strep, just like staph, can also cause necrotizing fasciitis. And here's our picture of that. Really pleasant, I know. The layers of the skin here, kind of like we saw from scalded skin syndrome, will just slough off and peel away as the skin just kind of gets eaten away. And this is really nasty and could really cause you to have to amputate someone's limb if it got really, really bad. Now, strep is easily treated by penicillin-derived antibiotics, and it's not known to show resistance. So I think we've all probably had the pink stuff before. I used to love to get liquid amoxicillin when I was a little kid, bubblegum flavor, because I just thought it was awesome. Today, you can get it in pill form too. Now that I'm a grown up, but if you have strep throat, they're probably going to give you one of those psyllin drugs to help get rid of it. Okay, last thing is E. coli, which here's the full name, which you may not have even known. That's Escherichia coli. So I broke this down for you, so you should be able to hopefully say it right. Escherichia coli. Everybody just calls it E. coli, mainly because the people on the news can't say Escherichia, is my guess. But E. coli is our 1 gram-negative bacterium that we're going to learn. This is a little different kind of picture. This is not gram-stained. But if this was gram-stained, it would be light pink. Right? Gram-negative bacterium. It's a bacillus, so it's a gram-negative rod or pill shape like you see here. E. coli has tons of these little cilia extensions on its surface that it uses to kind of feel around and move around and things. But it is a bacillus, so it's a rod. E. coli can cause a couple different infections. It is the most common cause of urinary tract infections worldwide. Now, without going into lots of details, urinary tract infections are way more common in girls than they are in guys. It has to do with the parts that you have down there. But urinary tract infections are really, really common just in general, so many of you have maybe had one before. And if you have a UTI, it was probably E. coli that caused it. E. coli is also pretty easily treatable with oral antibiotics, and so if you have a UTI, they might give you one of a couple different drugs that will help get rid of it. E. coli also is well known for being a food poisoner, so it can cause a gastrointestinal infection, so stomach and intestine infection. There's really 4 types of E. coli that are pathogenic to your gut tube. They cause different severity of GI infection, so sometimes they might just cause some diarrhea, vomiting for a day or two. Other times they can cause bleeding of the gut tube and just really, really severe and serious disorder that can be lethal. Deep E. coli infections can also be septic, so they can cause a blood infection, and they can also cause meningitis, which is an infection of your spinal cord. So these would both be examples of much more serious things. E. coli is, I say, popular here in the media, but E. coli is something a lot of people have heard about before, because it does have a tendency to contaminate food, and it can do so in a very broad range if food corporations or things aren't careful with their food. So beef products, other meat products like poultry and pork, if they're not refrigerated correctly, if they're not taken care of correctly, they can grow a lot of E. coli. Now what that means is, if you buy some food that has an E. coli contamination and you don't cook it all the way, it could make you sick, and it could make a lot of people sick if all of the beef at, say, one grocery store has E. coli growing in it. So this is also the cause for a lot of product recalls, where they recall all the frozen pizzas from this certain company that you might be able to buy because they may be high in E. coli. Okay, so that takes care of our bacteria. I know that was kind of lengthy, but then in class next time we'll get into some viral examples as well. Thanks for listening.